What up, guys? So, based off of the previous video where I showcased my tune, it's been brought to my attention that you guys would like a tutorial on how to get a said tune for your rig. Just keep in mind, I didn't pull this information out of my ass. I have to give credit to Chris Rosser and Brian Wright, aka the PID Toolbox guy, for even teaching me this info to begin with. Anyways, timestamps below, and let's get into this shit. First, let's make sure you have all four of these softwares downloaded, being BLHeli32, Betaflight, Betaflight Blackbox Explorer, and finally PID Toolbox. I'll have links to all of these in the description below. Starting with BLHeli32, this is essentially a software for your ESC. You're first going to plug in a battery to your drone, and then you're going to plug your bird into the computer. Next, you're just going to click Read Setup and wait for it to load. So first things first, let's check which firmware we're on. As the time of this recording, the latest firmware is 3210. If you're on anything less than that, then I would recommend going to ESC Flash and updating it to the latest firmware. Once you have that complete, there's only a few settings I like to change in here. The first is motor timing. I'll just set this to auto. And then PWM frequency, there's different ways you could go about this. The less you go on this slider, the more torque your motors have. The higher you go on this slider, the more efficient your motors are. And then there's also a feature called by RPM, where you can take PWM low, set this to the lowest value, PWM high, set this to the highest, where it says by RPM. This is just kind of like an all-around scenario, so it's both torquey and efficient, but I don't like to run it personally because it creates hotter motors, and I can't confirm this to be true or not, but in the past I've had experiences with the longevity of ESCs while running that. Personally, I always just set PWM high and low to 24, and that's what's worked best with me, but if your flying style is more casual, then 48 and 48 will probably do you better. And as far as the rest of the settings, this is all fine, so we'll just come here and click Right Setup, and then we can disconnect and unplug our battery. Next, we're going to go into Betaflight and make sure you're on the latest release. At the time of this recording, it's Betaflight 4.5 on version RC4. First things first, let's go to presets and type in your appropriate control link. For example, mine is Express LRS, so I just type in LRS, and I run my packet rate at 500 Hertz, so I would click this. And for the options, select Freestyle, Serial, Separate RX, and for these two settings, I just leave them blank and click Pick, and then save and reboot. What this does is essentially adjust these values accordingly, and also if we go into receiver, set an auto factor, or basically RC smoothing at the appropriate value. So next we're going to go down to Blackbox, and for the Blackbox logging device, let's go ahead and click serial port, make sure it's at least 2 kilohertz. And for the debug mode, we're going to select gyro scaled, and then we're going to save and reboot this. And then also, if this is full, make sure to erase it. And once you've completed all of those steps, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your bird outside and take off and slowly ramp up to 100% throttle, and then slowly ramp down to 0% and come back and land. This should honestly only take no less than 30 seconds, and make sure you disarm before you hit the ground. So whenever you start logging, make sure your quad is fully loaded out, as in action camera, fully weighted, and all that good stuff. And I believe it's about to rain, so I'm gonna hurry this shit up. So heading back into Betaflight, if we come down to Blackbox, I already accidentally erased this, but there will be an option right here that'll say activate mass storage device mode. You'll basically click on that, and then if you go to this PC, the device will be recognized. Basically just open it, and then your Blackbox file will be in here, and just drag it to a specified location of your choice. So once you have your Blackbox file loaded, as for graph setup, I like to have the graph 1 just for gyros for roll, pitch, and yaw. And then the graph 2 is debug, gyro scaled roll, gyro scaled pitch, and gyro scaled yaw, save changes. And if we come over here to debug and click gyro scaled roll, this little spectral analyzer thing will come up. If you're not seeing it, make sure to click this guy right there. So let's go ahead and make this full screen. And we're going to come up here to frequency and set this to frequency versus throttle. This is our bread and butter for filter tuning. Now, Betaflight filtering is very complex and can be very overwhelming. I'm going to try my best to explain it all. You might have to rewatch this part a few times to fully understand it. But basically, we are going to apply these numbers based off of what we're seeing from them. So, starting from Gyro Lowpass, essentially, if you've ever played video games before, Gyro Lowpass is an anti-aliasing filter. So in case you don't know, what that means is that it smooths out jaggedy lines that can be caused from having a PID loop frequency that's different from your gyro update frequency. So if you were running, for instance, a 4K PID loop frequency, you would want to have Gyro Lowpass enabled. But even if that's the case, with the latest releases of Betaflight, you should be able to disable Gyro Lowpass 1 and be perfectly fine. And if you're running the same PID loop frequency as your gyro update frequency, then you're fine disabling Gyro Lowpass 2. But I'm kind of a skeptic when it comes to fully disabling that. I just crash a lot and hardware tends to degrade. So rather than fully disabling it, I'm just going to take this slider and ramp it up to 2. It really won't hurt anything. That's Gyro Lowpass in a nutshell. Next, we have Gyro RPM filter. And what this does is take care of this line, and that line. We make the exposure brighter. You can kind of see them a little bit more. Reason why there's 3 is because I fly tri-blades. You probably fly them as well, so you'll probably have something similar. I know bi-blades will be different, quad blades will be different, but generally 90% of us fly tri-blade props, so this is what we're going to deal with. Now, Betaflight 4.5 implemented a new feature that minimizes the filtering effects on pretty much all of these, but what you want to do is apply it to these 2 lines. So if we minimize this exposure, you can see the second line is slightly dimmer than the third one. So what I like to do is go over to CLI, and we're going to type in set space RPM underscore filter underscore weights space equals 100. And if we pull this back up, I like to do these values in the thirds, but you can go about this in multiple ways. Since the second line is dimmer than the third, I'm going to set this to a value of 33. And the third line, I'm going to set to a value of 66. So essentially, what we just did is, if we press enter and save, is eliminate one gyro RPM filter. The Betaflight just doesn't recognize it in this tab. So what I'm getting to is technically we only have 2 RPM filter harmonics instead of 3. Hopefully that made sense. You might need to rewatch the last 2 minutes to fully understand that, but that's a new feature of 4.5, which is pretty neat. As for gyro RPM filter min frequency, how we determine that is that we look at this part right here, and you want to determine where it officially starts. For my case, it looks like 150, maybe 140. But to play things safe, I'm going to just set this to a value of 125, just so I can guarantee that's before the noise actually begins. And if we click save here, there's another CLI command we can type in, is set RPM underscore filter underscore fade underscore range underscore hertz space equals, and since the bulk of the noise really begins at 200 and we have our start filter at 125, 200 minus 125 equals 75. So I'm going to set this value of 75, press enter, and then write save. So instead of filters being in full effect at a frequency of 125 hertz, we have the filters slowly applied through a range between 125 and 200. 125 starting and 200 being at full effect. That's gyro RPM filtering in a nutshell. You might have to rewatch that. I'll see if I can throw up some visual images that might be easier to understand. Moving on to dynamic notch. Now, this prioritizes frame harmonics, which we can slightly see one right here. It's just this bright red area. So since it's very tight and small, first thing we can do is adjust the Q factor. I wouldn't take this higher than a value of 1,000, but what the Q factor is basically a graph that looks like this red line right here. The higher we make our Q factor, the tighter this graph gets. The lower we make it, the more it spreads out. Thus, higher number, less latency, lower number, more latency. But yeah, I want to take this higher than 1,000. I'm going to just play it safe and set it to 800. And if we look at this frame resonance, it starts at 200, maybe 195. But to play it safe, I'm going to set the min frequency to 180 and set the max frequency. It looks like the frame resonance ends at about 225, but just to play it safe, I'm going to set this to 225. And I only see one frame resonance, which is typical for 90% of 5-inch builds. Sometimes you can see multiple, sometimes you can see none. But for this case, we have one, so we leave the notch count at 1. And in terms of dynamic notch filtering, that's that. Now let's go over to D-term filtering. What this is all the area outside of these noise graphs. So this area up here, this area right here, and this area right there. I honestly just like to go off of Chris Rosser's method, which is disabling D-term Lowpass 2, turning this to off, and manually adjusting the minimum frequency to 80, the maximum frequency to 110, setting the dynamic curve expo to 7, and the filter type to biquad. This is kind of a universal preset that can work on a lot of clean 5-inch builds. But as far as tweaking this, I don't really see a need to. This is already pretty aggressive as it is. So last but not least, we have Yaw Lowpass filter. And this honestly just has a minuscule effect, as in there's just like no difference leaving this on or off. So you might as well just leave it on. And as far as filtering goes, that is everything. So I know that was kind of a lot to take in. You might have to rewind this a few times to fully understand it. I'm going to try my best in editing to throw in some images. That way it might make the gears start turning. That's how I learn, is through imagery. But yeah, that's filtering in a nutshell. Let's go ahead and save this and move on to PID tuning. Now, real quick, let's go ahead and go to CLI. And we're going to type in set space PID sum underscore limits space equals space 1000. And then if you press the up arrow key on your keyboard, you can bring that up, come back after limit underscore yaw, enter again, and then type save. What that does is fully unlock the PID authority within Betaflight. By default, these sliders only have a 50% effect, but with those two commands typed in, we now have essentially 100% control over the PIDs now. And we're going to change one setting, which is dynamic idle. This can vary on the type of props you like to run. I run very low pitch, so having a higher dynamic idle value, for instance 30 or even 35, suits a low pitch prop. If you run like a medium pitch prop, you might want to try 25, or high pitch, you might even want to go as low as 20, but for my case, 30 suits me best. So let's save that. Now we're going to basically take our Feedforward slider, bring that down to 0, dynamic dampening, and eye gains all the way down to 0. And we're first going to determine how far we can push our D-term. So basically what you're going to do is line of sight your quad and move your pitch and roll axis up and down, side to side, in circles for about 20 to 30 seconds, land, and then bump up your master multiplier. I recommend increments of 0.1. So we'll do 1.1, do the exact same thing, come back and land 1.2, and so on. And you need to pay attention to how your quad sounds. Once this slider gets too high, you'll start hearing like a whistling or a slight harmonic noise. And then also make sure to feel your motors every time you land. From my experience, motors tend to heat up before the harmonics start to really become apparent. And one more thing that's recommended, to do this in angle mode. It just makes results more consistent, and it's easier obviously to line of sight. So now that we have those logs recorded, what we're going to do is come over to PID Toolbox. And from my experience, PID Toolbox struggles to launch from the shortcut. So it's best to right click and go to Open File Location and launch it from the application itself by right clicking and clicking Run as Administrator. And this always takes forever to load. And once this finally loads, what we're going to do is come up here to Select, In my case, I put the master multiplier all the way up to 1.6, so I'm just going to select these two. Once those files are loaded, what we're going to do is come over to Step Response Tool, highlight all of these, and then click Y correction. So as you can see, this value represents 1 on the master multiplier, 1.1, 1.2, and I went all the way up to actually 1.5. And as you can see, as we increased it, the latency goes down. Same for pitch. The results can be inconsistent. That's just PID toolboxing in a nutshell. But you can see that once we hit about 1.4, it's actually the same as 1.5. Pitch is a little bit different just because the pitch value is still higher in latency than the roll latency. We'll get into a solution for that later, but by the looks of things, the motors also started to get a little warm at 1.5, and there's no difference in terms of latency between the two, so I'm going to leave the master multiplier at 1.4 and call it a day. Next, we're going to come up to P&I gains, and I like to drop this down to a value of 0.8 and increase in increments of 0.1, just like the master multiplier. Usually any value between 0.8 and 1.2 is mostly suited for 5-inch builds. So interesting result for this case. I was actually able to push the P&I slider all the way up to 1.5. But first, let me backtrack and actually explain. What we were looking for is the line to come up to the 1 value, maybe slightly overshoot it, and then stay on this one. When P&I is perfect, it'll basically look like this. When it's overdamped, it'll look like that, where it falls short. And then when P&I is too high, it'll basically overshoot and then come back down and do this little wave effect. But for our case, like I said, we were able to push P&I all the way up to 1.5 and still not have overshoot, which is kind of gnarly, but kind of like how 1.4 is looking. So I'm going to go with that. This is the ideal scenario, what you're going to want to be looking for. And the latency difference between 1.4 and 1.5 is pretty much non-existent. So coming back in the Betaflight, we're going to set this to 1.4, and that's good there. So quick little update. As I've started implementing some of the other features, I found the motors were getting a little bit too warm for my liking, so I backed down on the master multiplier down to 1.3. Next, we're going to move on to iTerm, and since the release of Betaflight 4.4, you can honestly ramp up iTerm to ridiculously high values without any repercussions. But iTerm is basically an extended P-term, mostly involving winds hitting your drone. iTerm is what's fighting that, basically keeping your drone stable. And the higher you have that, the more resistance your drone can have towards wind. When iTerm is pushed too high, your drone will have bounce back on flips and rolls, similar to having too high of a P-term. So to tune iTerm, I would honestly just take the slider and put it to 1. Go and do some flippy floppies with the goggles on. If there's no bounce back, then push it up into increments of 0.1. Do the exact same thing until you start seeing oscillations, and then back down a few. I personally saw them at 1.4. 0.3, it was very slight, and I decided to settle with 1.2, and that was absolutely fine. Ignore these numbers right here. I know they're ridiculously high, but this all revolves around software and how good the drone flies, and these numbers honestly don't mean anything. So that is iTerm. Now that the iTerm slider is adjusted, another thing to consider is iTerm relax. Essentially, it's a delay for the iTerm ramping up. Yes, it will still ramp up to these values, but if we make this number higher, it'll ramp up to these values slower. I believe this is based off of rates, or if you fly something like a race drone, this could also benefit you. In my case, since I have a very light freestyle drone with fast rates, I'm going to set this to a value of 20. Setting that to 20 honestly probably won't make a difference, but for my style and the way my drone is built, that seems to be best suited for it. And if you have a build that's pretty similar to how mine is, setting it to 20 may benefit you as well. Now, anti-gravity is basically the opposite of iTerm relax. The higher this value, the quicker it'll boost iTerm along with P-term. So where anti-gravity comes into play is if your quad center of gravity is off placed, or your flight controller is mounted in the front or the rear. But if your rig has a pretty good CG, I wouldn't really worry too much about anti-gravity. I know some people who tune will say you can push this up to values of like 12 or even 15, but I haven't had an issue with it being at 8, and it's worked fine for me. So next, we're going to adjust the feedforward slider, and I would start this at 0.6 and go up in the increments of 0.2. What you're going to be doing is flying with the goggles again, similar to iTerm, and just doing flippy floppies. And you really have to push feed forward to see a noticeable effect. But I think a good stopping point is at 1.4. Worst case, after looking at the logs, we can push it more if need be. And you'll know it's too high when the start of a move seems to oscillate along with the end of the move. So when tuning feed forward, you're going to want to open the log up itself. Now that you have your log loaded, let's go ahead and come up to workspace and save that. Now we're going to come up to graph setup and remove all these ones since we saved the previous ones. And we're going to come up to add graph. Let's go ahead and add gyro plus PID roll and gyro plus PID pitch. Now the OCD in me likes to change feed forward to orange and the gyro roll to purple, and same thing for pitch. For both of these, let's go ahead and add set point, and let's look for set point roll and add a field for pitch and add set point pitch. And I like to make this green, and that should be good. Okay, now these giant blue bars indicates the flips and rolls that we did. So if we come to this one, for example, you can see that the gyro is lagging behind the set point, and that indicates the feed forward is too low. If we come to another instance right here, on roll axis, it's actually pretty on par. Let's come to here. Yeah, so roll, except for the very top, it seems to lag at the very end. And pitch, same scenario. It's relatively good, but at the very end, there is some lag. So let's go ahead and come up to an ideal situation, which this was where I had the slider at 1.2. And as you can see, the set point and the gyro are right on top of each other. And looking at this graph on pitch, the feed forward for pitch seems to be a little bit too high from how I'm looking at this, but it's not too big of a deal, and this is fine. I'm liking feed forward being on 1.2, so that's where I'm going to set this up. And so last but not least, we have dynamic dampening. Basically, what this does is counteract feed forward. So if we look here, we can see that the gyro is massively lagging behind the set point. And the best way to fix that is to add dynamic dampening. If you by chance run slower rates, this could be less significant. The higher your rates are, the more of a gap you'll have in between this. So I would recommend starting at 0.8 and going up into increments of 0.1 all the way up until you get to 1.2 and stopping there. So Jim from the future here, I actually realized that this Blackbox file was mixed in with feed forward, and not trying to overcomplicate things. This is basically dynamic dampening being at 1.1. If we come here, we can see that there still is a little bit of lag behind here, but it does catch up with the set point. So that's the ideal thing to look for. And I wish my Blackbox logs were a bit more organized, but dynamic dampening is essentially the opposite of feed forward, just trying to find the gyro aligning with the set point in the best possible position when the stick travel is coming back to center. And yeah, we are currently 23 minutes into this video, and I've somehow managed to explain everything there is to know about PID tuning. Hopefully it wasn't rushed, and hopefully you guys learned something and could apply it to your own builds. That is the whole reason why I do this to begin with. But if you have any questions, suggestions, feedback, just leave it in the comments. We can argue or discuss certain things. If you have a lot more personal questions about your own rig, feel free to message me on Instagram. As I don't have the best reputation for getting back to YouTube comments. I'm working on it. I'm sorry. But if you really do have a question, just message me on Instagram and I'll try my best to get back to you. But that's really honestly all I have. The flight you're seeing right now is with this tune, and I just really want to thank you for watching this whole video, or just skipping to the end. Thank you for clicking on the video anyway, I guess. But that's really all I got, and enjoy me getting stuck in this tree at the end. Later, guys.
When I think back, I think of times we went most of driving down a PCH, living in a moment. Long summer night, smoking, staring at the ocean, sitting on an island where the sun says golden. I know the universe will give us back what we put in. My heart stay broke, but my mind stay resilient. Remember all those times that you said that we shouldn't. Try to convince me that I had one foot in, but I know you gave me everything that you had. Now you on the top, girl, don't look back. Everything in front, you don't let it distract. Hope you're killing everything that's in your path. Yeah, girl, go keep that passion. Everything else burns to ashes. This life won't come, go attack it. But
why did we have to leave? 'Cause now we barely speak. But life happens. At night I still can't sleep when you're not next to me.